Welcome into a special episode of the Boys Collective right here on 105.3 The Fan. My name is Kevin Gray, alongside 1/4 of the G-Bag Nation and Super Bowl winning scout Bryan Broaddus. And also joining us today, our Dallas Cowboys Insider for 105.3 The Fan, Bobby Belt, even though he knows it's not Christmas time anymore.
Merry Christmas.
Gentlemen, good morning. Good to have you on this special episode here as Jerry had some things to say, Bryan, to start off with, as he wanted to jump on 105 through The Fan and clarify some things, if you will, as we're recording this just a few minutes after he spoke with the KNC Masterpiece this morning.
Yeah, I think that it was, Jerry, Jerry can be very emotional in the way, and again, I worked with him for 14 years. There's some ups and downs. This team is really important to him. We look at him as a billionaire and all that stuff like that. And, there's things with Jerry that he's like he said himself, he's a very easy read. Where Jerry Jones is, when it comes to certain subject matters and stuff. So, he wanted to come on air and talk about and, clarify some things that have been in the media here the last week, that Jerry was disappointed. Yeah, he still is disappointed. But he also wanted to talk about how him and Mike McCarthy are this unified front and how important it was to get Dan Quinn done. So, it's one of those things, whether you believe it or not, take him at his word. But he wanted to make sure that no, it wasn't Jerry Jones going after Sean Payton now. It was Jerry Jones working with Dan Quinn, with Mike McCarthy to get Dan Quinn back and then get this thing hopefully back on track for Cowboy fans.
Bobby, I was telling my wife before Jerry Jones got on, it's like when the president says that he has a state of the address that he wants to give, everything pretty much stops. When Jerry Jones says he has something that he wants to say, things pretty much stop when it comes to the Cowboys and DFW sports. Is that what you heard from him this morning with respect to Mike McCarthy, Dan Quinn, Kellen Moore, which we'll get into more specific here in a moment? Did it jive with what you have been understanding and coming to learn about the situations with both of these coordinators, or was it something a little bit different based on what Jerry had said this morning?
I think there was probably a little bit of spin on some of it, and probably a little bit of finesse with the wording that he used. Like, I thought it was funny when they said, "Are you saying that Dan Quinn was offered a job and you convinced him to stay?" That he said, "I believe that. I believe that." It wasn't a yes, he was, and yes, it was, I believe that. Yeah, sure. And so I think that there was a bit of a calculated choosing of words and things like that. And so, I think that a lot of what he said was true. I know they wanted to get Dan Quinn back. I'm sure they are. We're trying to make that happen to the best of their abilities as possible. I don't know that I buy that that's the reason he refused to take questions on Mike McCarthy's future, is because he didn't want teams to think so highly of Dan Quinn they came and got him. Some of it didn't totally connect. But I think I think he's telling the truth that, like, Mike's back. And I think he's telling the truth that was communicated to Mike right after the game or right after the season. I think it was something that there needed to be a cool down period. I think it was an understanding, but I also fully believe still that Mike McCarthy is on the hot seat heading into this season, and that the leash is not very long, not nearly as long as Jerry was insinuating it was today, but it's January and there's a lot of time left.
You can find Bryan on Twitter at Bryan Broaddus. You can find Bobby on Twitter at BobbyBeltTX. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, and make sure you subscribe to 105 through The Fan on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and of course on 105throughthefan.com. So, Bryan, let's start there then. So Mike McCarthy, coming off a 12-5 year, gets his team into the playoffs. They lose, obviously, in the first round. And then Sean Payton retires and leaves the Saints after winning a Super Bowl, decade and a half with that football team. The initial conversation was, well, is Sean Payton going to be the next head coach of the Dallas Cowboys? And what kind of timeline could that look like? And what does that look like as far as the hot seat for Mike McCarthy? From what you understand about Sean Payton and his situation, how likely do you feel like that could happen now that Jerry Jones has pretty much confirmed that Mike McCarthy's going to be back in 2022 now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I don't think that I have a friendship with Sean Payton, and I've worked with Sean Payton in a couple of different stops. Jerry mentioned him turning down the opportunity with the Raiders. I was in the back channeling, working with the Raiders, trying to help Sean at the time, because of my relationship with people at the Raiders. And they wanted to make sure they wanted to interview Sean Payton for that job, but they didn't want Sean Payton to turn them down. That was Al Davis's number one concern. He didn't want it to be a deal where they were going after Sean. They were committed to talking to Sean, and then Sean said no. That was their biggest fear. And, Sean Payton was on his way to tell Jerry Jones that, hey, I'm going to I'm going to talk to the Raiders about the opportunity. Jerry talked him out of it. That is absolutely true. And so there's always been kind of this back channeling thing when it comes to these NFL coaches. Jerry mentioned he had not talked to Sean Payton. Me personally, I have not talked to Sean Payton asking, but I've talked to enough people. Sean and I share a lot of common relationships.
Sure.
And, so the people that have talked to Sean believe that he's honestly going to take the year off. He left the Saints he knew that if he didn't leave the Saints now, he was never going to leave the Saints. And he knew he had to. The season took a lot out of him. The quarterback situation, the fact that they started the season on the road because of the hurricane stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a lot that the COVID stuff, there were a lot of things that Sean Payton was dealing with throughout the year, and it just got wore down. He really legitimately got wore down. And so him taking time off is, I think, the absolute truth. I think that Jerry talked about it, the relationship that he has with Sean. That is absolutely 100% accurate, how those two do care about each other, and some great stories between the two. But yeah, I think that Jerry, I honestly believe that all bets are off, though, if this team does not accomplish what it needs to accomplish in 2022. That rightfully so. I mean, I don't care if it's Dan Quinn or Mike McCarthy or whoever. Jerry Jones is not going to sit there and continue to allow Mike McCarthy and this team to not reach their goals. And he said every year there's one team that makes it and everybody else kind of doesn't. But there's certain levels that you have to at least show that you're making that kind of improvement. And I think with Jerry, I think he's willing to ride with Mike McCarthy for one more year. But again, if all, Sean, let's be honest too, Sean Payton could like TV and pull a Bill Cowher. Remember, every year Bill Cowher was a name. And then it just came to the point where Bill Cowher's not going to coach anymore, and maybe Sean gets good enough at TV where he doesn't want to coach anymore. Now, he left it open as the possibility to coach, but I do think for 2022, Jerry's going to give Mike McCarthy, Dan Quinn, and if Kellen Moore doesn't get a head coaching job, he's going to give those three the opportunity to try and get this team further along than just winning the NFC East.
It's funny because I had mentioned to someone the other day that if Sean Payton does decide to go to television, I would feel like Fox would want, let's say Fox, for example, would want a minimum of a couple of year commitment, especially if you're going to work on the A team with Joe Buck to potentially try to build, chemistry there. So I thought that was kind of an interesting that you brought that up as a talking point there, because I think that's kind of an underrated part of the discussion of whether or not he decides to go to television. How long would he need to commit to make that thing, actually work there? Bobby, I'll go to you on this because obviously the relationship with McCarthy, Quinn, and Kellen Moore and that triangle is very interesting given the dynamics on how Dan Quinn was able to turn around this defense and how that obviously helped the Cowboys during the second half of the year. Juxtaposing that with Kellen Moore and his inability during the second half of the year to really not get this offense where it needed to be. How do these three work together now based on what has happened in the last couple of weeks and now moving forward with such a cloud hanging over the three of them, more so for Mike McCarthy in the Sean Payton deal, about how that will look now going into the offseason and what that means for the three of these gentlemen?
I mean, I think it's going to be a big challenge. It's something that they're going to have to answer after every loss. I mean, if you look at the fact that, let's just imagine that, they go 12-5 next year, which would be another really good year. That still means that you spent 5 weeks, because it'll be something we talk about the whole, afterwards. That meant you spent 5 weeks of your season distracted, having to talk about, Mike McCarthy's future, because it will be every single loss, every single time that somebody loses, especially if Sean Payton has an analyst job. Sean Payton's sitting in one of these studios and he's able to instantly react in post game to what just happened with the Cowboys. And we're all able to juxtapose that with what Mike McCarthy said in the post game. It is going to be a massive cloud hanging over their head. Now, if you take Jerry at his word and Mike McCarthy's his guy, then, there's nothing he can do to control that, because if he believes in Mike McCarthy and Sean Payton happens to be available, he can't control what people think. I think the issue is that most people believe that's who he has eyes on for the future. And so by delaying it or not making a move sooner, you're opening yourself up to questions. But I think that, it'll be something, again, that kind of hangs over everybody, even to a smaller extent with, Kellen Moore and Dan Quinn, and in terms of just, that they're potentially coaching for their next jobs, and how, hey, you were somebody that people wanted last off season and they were able to retain you. And so, it's a little bit of shifting sand, the foundation. And so I don't know that that's a great way to enter next year. But it's the bed they've made, and how they'll have to approach it in 2022. And, I think it'll definitely be a factor that we're talking about as a potential distraction into next year.
Hey, guys, I kind of feel like something, too, that maybe learned a little bit more. The question, I believe, was asked by Corey Majors about Kellen Moore and the offense, or maybe Mike Bassick asked it, but it was about Mike McCarthy getting more involved with the offense, and Jerry Jones was adamant about, oh no, yeah, everything we have to do, I mean, that to me is a real key here, because if you don't see further development, if you don't see, and I'm not talking it has to be what the Cowboys were the first 6 weeks of 2021, but if this Cowboy offense fails and it's not as efficient and they're not scoring in the red zone, he's really put Mike McCarthy on point that if it's not good enough, you're responsible for this thing too. So to me, I think that was something key, because Mike McCarthy really doesn't want to take responsibility for Kellen Moore's offense. He doesn't believe in that. But what Jerry Jones has done is said, no, you need to jump in there and help if you have to, So if this offense fails because of anything that Kellen Moore does and Mike McCarthy's not able to salvage it, there's your grounds for dismissal. When Jerry Jones at the end of the year, if it's 9-8, they finish second in the division, they don't get in the playoffs, and they want to make a coaching change. If the offense wasn't good enough, then now it's on. He's now brought Mike McCarthy into the focus of, okay, you have to figure out things to make this offense go. He even told you he thought his quarterback's a Super Bowl winning type of quarterback. You're not going to get through this season of just being okay on offense and get to the Super Bowl. That's just not going to happen.
It's interesting because the both of you have talked about the idea of how much this building, talking about the Star in Frisco and this organization, loves working with Dan Quinn, and how players and personnel love working with Dan Quinn and what he's brought. I'm interested on the flip side with Kellen Moore, the working relationship between Mike McCarthy and Kellen Moore and vice versa, and relative to players, organization, and personnel is what, when it comes to Kellen Moore and Mike McCarthy. Bobby, I'll start with you on that. What would that be, or how could you characterize that if you could?
So I think that there's a bit of an interesting dynamic there, because I think that Kellen Moore was obviously Jason Garrett's guy and Scott Linehan's guy. And so, I wonder if there's always going to be, in any sort of, even if you believe in Kellen Moore and you want to keep the continuity. And so Mike McCarthy was like, yeah, let's bring him back. I wonder if there's always going to just be some sort of natural, tension there, or just philosophical differences because of that. And so that's something that I'm sure is at play at times. And there's been a tendency to be pretty hands off and to say, like, or I guess what's being said by what's not being said, which is when he says, hey, whoever they're going to install it, they're going to call it. I don't think it makes sense. That's kind of all Kellen's, very, very clearly stating to everybody that anything that's going on with the offense is Kellen Moore's responsibility. And I think that, they work pretty independent of each other. Whereas Jason Garrett always had the line about it's a collaborative effort. We're all working together. We get some input from these guys and this guy's in here and here. You don't hear that sort of talk with Mike McCarthy and Kellen Moore. And I mean, this is 2 consecutive off seasons where since, Mike McCarthy got here, where Kellen Moore has been interviewing for multiple jobs, has clearly been interested in it. Even leading up to the San Francisco game was much more coy about wanting to just not talk about potential other jobs, in terms of just didn't want to even acknowledge that it was something that existed. Whereas Dan Quinn said, look, I'm focused on this. And here, that wasn't Kellen Moore's talk. So, I mean, I do think that Kellen Moore has more immediate aspirations to have a job that's not here. I don't know that it's worked out to this point. Potentially it could in Miami. I talked to some people this morning who that's down to Dable, Mike McDaniel in San Francisco, and Kellen Moore. And there were some people who felt like Dable was the favorite with the Giants and the Dolphins. And it was just going to come down to whose offer did he like more, who gave him more power. And so, I mean, if Dable goes to the Giants, yeah, you're looking at genuinely, it could be McDaniel and Moore. And so he's got a real shot at that job in Miami. But, Jerry talked about how he's confident he's coming back. Talked about how,
he wants him back.
Mike, yeah, he wants him back. Mike's going to have a hand in helping to fix anything that's there. It's funny that Jerry's talking like that, and Kellen and Mike have not talked like that. They haven't talked about, oh, well, Mike's coming in here and helping out. And, how Mike's hasn't said, well, I was in there, doing this or that. And Mike has said that, oh, that's Kellen's thing. And so there is, I don't know that there's tension as much as it's just they're apart. It doesn't feel like there's a close, collaborative working relationship there.
Yeah, I think Bobby gave a great answer there. I think the thing that you have to keep in mind, though, with Mike McCarthy is, I got in a lot of trouble on our station with people because I knew a lot that was going on in Green Bay, and I knew stuff that was going on in Dallas with, and talking to staff and people like that about Mike. And, Mike was totally comfortable letting Kellen Moore call the offense because he didn't want to do the work to put his own offense in. He didn't want to have to teach everybody what he wanted to do. It got that way in Green Bay. Even though he was a play caller and stuff, there was a time Mike McCarthy was outstanding as a play caller. Now, he had a Hall of Fame quarterback to work it with, but he was really good at one time. And the later he's gotten in his career, the least he wants to do it. It's almost like, I don't want the criticism. I don't want people on me about it. When things are struggling, and Aaron Rodgers is saying, this is a joke. We don't motion. We don't do this. There's no creativity. I don't think Mike wants that. I don't think he wants to have to deal with that spotlight that way. And he was probably super happy the first, last year they didn't have the quarterback. Okay, that's fine. Take away that year. But then here they start 6-1. The offense is humming. That's a dream for Mike McCarthy. He's like, God, thank God I don't have to, Kellen Moore, he's called the offense. He got the quarterback to play well. All that's going in a positive way. On the other side, Dan Quinn, my gosh, look what he's done with the defense. This was the perfect situation for Mike McCarthy. He could be a manager. He didn't have to be a coach, and now he's going to have to step in and okay, well, I guess I got to help Kellen Moore. I guess I got to help him. I guess I got to, throw my 2 cents in there and all that. I'm not saying that Mike doesn't give ideas and stuff, but Mike just didn't want to roll up his sleeves and jump in there with Kellen Moore and try and fix things. If he would have, this offense wouldn't have been bad for 10 weeks. It wouldn't have struggled the way it did for 10 weeks. So I think that Jerry, like I said, I think Jerry just put Mike back into the middle of something he really, really didn't want to do. And I didn't think he wanted the criticism of a primary play caller. and so that I think in itself is something that, that to going forward for him to be here, he might have to do something more that he really, really, really doesn't want to do.
It's very interesting because 2 points that both of you have made about Bryan, to your point about McCarthy not helping this offense during the last 10 weeks of the year that really could have changed the dynamics of how this offense actually worked and why that didn't happen. And Bobby, to your point, the lack of communication or not the kind of communication that you would think from the outside looking in that you would want your coach, who's an offensive minded coach, to have with this offensive coordinator, especially when he's struggling. Is that something that the two of you think can be fixed or needs to be fixed for this offense to be able to be at the best it can be? Because that to me is concerning. If I'm a fan listening to this, why doesn't my offensive minded coach have the kind of relationship with my offensive coordinator, especially if that's something that I'm supposed to have that kind of expertise in, if I'm Mike McCarthy? Bobby, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is probably what's going on is Doug Nussmeier has had a big hand in things, has worked a lot. So I'm guessing that any sort of that help that Kellen may have needed, there's probably a leaning on like, okay, well, Nuss is there to, kind of give a hand. And this is somebody that's been with Kellen over these last few years, has been with him as he's, had this trajectory to play caller. And so I would guess that that's where they're not just totally leaving him on an island. I'm guessing that Mike's just kind of alleviating the responsibility a little bit and pushing it off over somewhere else. I think it's interesting that, we talked about Ben McAdoo being in the building, a former offensive coordinator, somebody who's here. And then it turns out he wasn't even, the McCarthy protege wasn't even necessarily helping Kellen as much as he was helping Dan Quinn.
Right.
So I think it is just interesting how you hear about, I know Doug Nussmeier definitely is heavily involved in helping with the game plan. And so it is just interesting that you've got these two, Garrett era coaches, Scott Linehan era coaches, Nussmeier and Moore, that kind of have their own little section away from, any sort of McCarthy influence. Not that they've sheltered themselves from it, but that McCarthy has allowed them to do that. And that there could be an argument to be made if you want to play devil's advocate that, look, this is what was best for Dak Prescott. Dak Prescott went through 3 quarterback coaches in 3 years. He changed out offensive coordinators. It just made sense to keep things going that direction instead of having to have him learn something totally new. That is an argument to be made. But I do think that a lot of it is just about that, all right, there's a bit of a different philosophy here. I don't want to come in and overhaul everything. And instead of even peppering in my perspective on it, we'll just let Nuss be the veteran coach that can help out.
But what did and Bobby, you know this because you know that building well. What did Dan Quinn do? Dan Quinn sat down and learned and the first thing he did when he met with the defense was, you guys actually did some things pretty good. Yeah. And I'm going to not just totally scrap everything that you're doing in order to make it my way or the highway. And I think that's the thing that endeared Dan to the defense, to the staff there and all that he was willing to make, he goes like, hey, I don't have all the answers, but man, I sure like some of the things I've seen that you guys have done. That's the thing that that's the thing that's disappointing about with Mike McCarthy to me is that he just wasn't willing to say, hey, Kellen, this week I'm going to give you some stuff, or I'm going to call plays here. Was he worried about killing Kellen? Was he worried about, no, I mean, this team needed on defense. They played it the exact way you needed to play, the way the staff worked together, the way they got better every week. You saw them get better. With the offense, it was like, well, why do you have all these offensive coaches and you still have problems? If I'm the head coach and my area of expertise is offense, I'm over there every single day trying to say, okay, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's do this. When they show Mike McCarthy on the sidelines, he's got his play sheet. I'm looking down at that play sheet and I'm finding stuff. I'm clicking over to Kellen. Hey, think about this. Think about this. But he didn't want to do it that way. Where the guy on the other side of the ball was like, hey, I see good things you're doing. I'm going to keep incorporating those. But, you know, on the offensive side of the ball, you never really saw that. You saw the same kind of patterns, and it was almost to the point where it was a joke, like on the radio, that they were holding stuff back, that they weren't, you know, they weren't even like, they were like, hey, let's not show everything we got. But no, the last 10 weeks of the season, they showed you everything that they had. You know, it never changed from, say, after that Minnesota game.
I want to run something by you real quick, Bryan. I'm curious what you think about this. Is, you know, there was one time, the only time I ever saw, I've seen anything in 2 years here where I go like, maybe that's a McCarthy influence on offense. Maybe that's something he communicated, but we saw it for just like 2 weeks and then it went away. Was them putting CeeDee Lamb in the backfield the way Mike used to do that with Ty Montgomery in Green Bay. And so do you think maybe there are some small areas like that maybe we've seen some suggestions and then quickly Kellen goes, that didn't work. I'm not doing that. You think that maybe there has been one of those little popover things and Kellen's just said, no, I'm doing my own thing.
Well, I mean, you know, I can't
obviously we don't know.
No, I can't sit here and tell you, no, Bobby, that's wrong. But I know Kellen steals plays from other, you know, the really good play callers steal. The good coordinators steal. They really do. Probably watching, you know, probably the breakdown guys were watching the 49ers. And you're right about Mike. Mike was one of the first that I'd seen put a running back, but Mike did that out of necessity. He had nothing. I mean, he had no running backs at the time at Green Bay. He was forced to try and make something out of nothing. Much like Dan Quinn had no defensive end pass rush, so he had to put Micah Parsons in. You know, so to me, I think that was more about maybe Kellen Moore kind of thinking, this is kind of cool what San Francisco's doing. You know, we've seen it before. The Rams had done it before, you know, a couple of years ago. I mean, there's teams that just kind of, it's San Francisco hangs their hat on it. Everybody else kind of just, it's kind of a quirky little thing that they do. Yeah. And so I can't sit there and slam McCarthy and say, or slam you and say, oh, no, that had nothing to do with it. But I will say the fact that they didn't stick with it, I think that's more of a little wrinkle that he was trying just to incorporate, and he moved on from there.
Yeah, and not to say that was what I even think that was the case. Just playing devil's advocate.
No, absolutely. I mean, like I said, Dan Quinn did things that was like Dan did things out of necessity. Dan Quinn went and did the homework that Mike McCarthy told everybody he did. That's exactly right. Dan actually went out in the backyard into the farmhouse and figured things out. Whereas Mike, you know, and again, Mike and I are roughly the same age. You get to a point in time where you're like, man, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to work? Man, I've got this taken care of. Do I really, really want to do, you know? Mike, I think there's some of that to Mike. I really do. I think there's some like, okay, if I could just, and I call it a manager. I manage here. I manage the team. I manage the coaches. I manage the media. You know, I'm just managing. I'm managing. I'm not coaching. I'm just managing, you know? And that's where I think that's where we're at.
To your point, it wasn't just the game plan. I know that Mike McCarthy had told teams in interviews, not just Dallas, but also apparently communicated to Dallas, hey, I don't want anything to do with the personnel. I don't want to pick your player. Like, I mean, he was very clear about, I want to come in here and I mean, it's kind of stunning. When you boil it down, he basically said, I want to come in here and do as little as possible, you guys.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I get it. When you get to a certain time, you just like, hey, I mean, you know, my NFL pension and the lake house and all, you know, it's just, there's things that like, I don't want to have to fight this every day. I don't want to have to answer Sean and RJ's questions every day about why I'm not doing this. You know, there comes a point in time of that. But with Mike, you know, Mike needed to step up in some certain areas. I think that's the thing I think Mike McCarthy's a fine coach. I just wish Mike McCarthy wasn't like me looking to go to the lake house. You know, I mean, that seems to be, that's kind of the same. We're both on the same path to the lake house is what we're doing.
Which to your point, I will say that, and this is kind of a little offshoot, but still something that'll be interesting to watch in the next couple of weeks. I've heard some people talk about maybe that's Joe Philbin's issue too, a little bit. Joe Philbin's got it. Joe Philbin maybe has his eye on the lake house a little bit. You know,
he's been around for a long time.
I don't want to get into
tired, guys. I swear to God, you get tired. You get tired. I mean, trust me, doing radio for 5-6 hours a day is a blessing compared to working a scout 16, 17 hours a day traveling around the country. It's a blessing to do just 5-6 hours or do a 30-minute podcast with you guys. It's a blessing, but you get to a point in time. And like you say, with the Joe Philbin thing, I wonder about that. To me, that's the next, if you're going to keep everything status quo, Mike McCarthy, I would give you so much credit for this if you did this. If you took Joe Philbin and you said, Joe, I'm sorry, it's not working. We got to go another direction. If he were to remove his friend as the offensive line coach and go out and get another line coach, I would have so much more respect for Mike McCarthy and him really, really, really trying to turn things around here with this offensive line and their ability to run block and their ability to pass block.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, especially on that front, because I think that's one of the next major things that we'll be looking at as the offseason goes on. Right, we hope. Lastly, before we get out of here today, so where do the Cowboys go from here? Jerry Jones got on 105 through the fan with the Kansas City Masterpiece. Said, hey, look, guys, I wasn't wishy-washy about Mike McCarthy's job status. You were the guys out there saying that he was twisting out in the wind and that kind of thing. Maybe a little bit of word semantics. You can take that however you want. But now that McCarthy's gotten his quote-unquote reassurance that he'll be back in 2022, Dan Quinn back into the fold going forward, and Kellen Moore expected to be back, how do they go from here with Jerry Jones obviously running things and what this team will look like? Bryan, we'll start with you before we go to Bobby. How do you think, where do they go from here now with all of this based on what has happened and the way things have happened over the last 2.5 weeks?
Yeah, I was very hopeful. I love Sean Payton. I really, really do. I know Sean Payton's tired. I really know that. I mean, he's, all the things I talked about when we started, Sean Payton's not ready to take the Dallas Cowboys job. And, but I'm also saying that I don't think Mike McCarthy is a terrible coach, but I wish Mike McCarthy wasn't a manager. I wish he was a coach. I wish Mike McCarthy would roll up his sleeves and, because I think Jerry Jones wants to roll up his sleeves. And, Jerry Jones is in a unique situation just because of his age. And I'm not trying to be morbid or mean-spirited at all, but you get to a certain time. And last week I made a mention of this. He buried a great friend of his, John Madden. He was at a memorial service in Oakland, California. Then his football team loses a game, and then he's very emotional. And you don't know, none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. And that's why Jerry, I think, was so adamant about playing football in a pandemic, because he's like, I don't know how many more days I have of doing this. I've got to play football now. As bad as it was during the season and all that, and losing his quarterback and all that, Jerry believed, I've got to play football. I'm not guaranteed tomorrow. And, I think that with Jerry's attitude, I was hopeful. I hope he keeps the pressure on Mike McCarthy. I hope he keeps the pressure on Dan Quinn. I hope that he keeps the pressure on Kellen Moore. I hope he keeps the pressure on Will McClay and Stephen Jones. The thing I worry about is people being comfortable over there, because the minute everybody's comfortable over there, my football team's no good. And I'm not trying to have to scare people and be mean and, and all that. I just don't need you comfortable. I just don't need you. It's okay. We lost. It's all right. We did, like Jerry said, we did some good things. I don't need that. I don't need it. If I'm a Cowboy fan, I don't want to hear we did some good things. Yeah, Dan Quinn, did some good things. But you're not playing. You're not playing this weekend. The goal is to play this weekend, to be in the Super Bowl. And I just want Jerry Jones to now, to come back and make people feel uncomfortable for their jobs. And if it doesn't get done, I fully expect this time next year that we're talking about, if it's Sean Payton or somebody else. But I think the expectations for the Cowboys was just raised another notch, because Jerry believes in Mike McCarthy. He believes in Kellen Moore. He believes in Dan Quinn. And if those guys let him down, I could see this thing changing. And you know what? I'm all for it. if it doesn't work out and they don't get to where they need to be, I am all for Jerry Jones doing whatever he has to do to make this thing go the direction it needs to go.
You know, I have a few thoughts here. First off, I wanted to work this in. I know you mentioned in how disappointing the season was. I had done some research this morning before I went on Sean and RJ and found something out where it's they weren't just disappointing in a vacuum. They were historically disappointing. 57 times since the merger, there's been a team have a point differential of 170 or more. And this team is the first one that didn't make it to the divisional round of the playoffs out of 57 teams since the merger. And so you were historically disappointing given, expectations entering the playoffs. And I think that didn't sit well with Jerry. And Jerry can talk about Mike was always safe and this and that. And, he's got to say what he's got to say right now, given the fact that this is who they're rolling with. But you can't tell me there were too many people telling me, that I talked to that he was upset and he was asking, is this our guy? Bryan, you mentioned how that was a conversation about Dak during the contract. Yeah. I think he was asking.
I got in trouble for that. Yeah.
I think he was asking the same question though about Mike McCarthy after the game. I think he said, "Is this our guy? Y'all sure? Is this our guy?" And so, because I think he's always thought Sean Payton is my guy, and if Sean Payton were available, I know that's my guy. I know that guy can win, and I think he's always regretted letting him get out of the building. And I think he believes in Dan Quinn. And maybe that's also part of what's going on here in securing him here is that, hey, if Mike McCarthy's done in a year, I got Sean Payton on the market. I can look at maybe Dan Quinn as an option internally. If Sean really loves broadcasting, I think that there's laying a foundation here. But to kind of bring it back full circle, KG, your question, which was a good one about the pressure that's on this team now and things with all these, bringing back McCarthy and us talking about how, when they lose games, there's going to be a lot of focus on that. I will tell you the pressure to me just ratcheted up a ton on Dak Prescott, and not just how he needs to perform on the field, but how he needs to lead this locker room and how he needs to be a steady force. And he has to be better than he was with the media at the end of the season. And I don't mean that as he's got to answer my questions. I don't care about that. What I care about is that he shows a strong, steady hand. We saw those reports about Mike Nolan and the coaching staff, and they're terrible at their jobs. When did that come out? Like 10 days after Dak was out of that locker room, holding it steady. That leadership was gone. Sean Lee was, hurt coming back, but didn't have the same sort of leadership role. As soon as Dak left, you saw it all kind of wobbled, and it was all, okay, now it's leaking. And he's a very steady factor in that locker room. I was disappointed with the way he seemed to handle that leadership mantle at times at the end of the season. But I don't think that that's something that can't be undone. I think I still would have high expectations for him, but I would say that's a big area of pressure this season on Dak Prescott, not just stepping up and playing well, but look, these guys, just by the nature of where they're at and who's available, Quinn and Moore wanting to get jobs out there, Mike McCarthy being on the hot seat, there's not much they're going to be able to say to quiet things. And so you're going to have noise all season, Dak, and you got to make sure that you're on top of keeping these guys engaged. And so I think there's just a lot of pressure now on Dak Prescott from not just a performance standpoint, but as a leader.
It almost feels that regardless of the gentlemen that were going to be working for this team, whether or not, because it's always been this way for the Cowboys, the expectation of winning a championship, it feels that much more going into next year than it's felt like in a long time, given what looms potentially after the 2022 season with the whole Sean Payton deal sitting out there, that at this team, we thought that if they didn't get to the NFC Championship game or beyond was crucial this year. I can only imagine how much more that increases now going into 2022 about the exponential rise in expectations given all that's transpired now in the last, 2.5 weeks. So I would say to that point, that definitely falls not only on the quarterback, but on all of these gentlemen now, given what has happened now with this team.
Yeah, I'll tell you what's disappointing probably for Jerry Jones is that he felt like he had a Super Bowl type of roster. And that roster, when we all talk about this team as we get going in the spring, that team's going to look a lot different, and I'll be interested to see, do you have all those Super Bowl pieces that you had before, Stephen Jones came on our station, and we're talking about before the playoff game, that Friday before the playoff.
My man was already talking about saving money and what we got to do.
He's talking about the cap and what's going to happen. And
I paid my quarterback $40 million.
Yeah. I mean, so to me, if this thing turns into 9-8 and it's, there's a lot of some of the same pieces. And I love what Bobby's talking about with Dak. I think it's on him too. And Dak is one of those guys that whether he really, really believes it or not, he always say, give me the pressure, give me the pressure, give me the pressure. There's going to be a point in time where you say, give me the pressure, and you don't deliver. The fans everybody's going to say, you can't handle the pressure, And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure. There's pressure on guys in the front office and coaching every year. Sure. There's different kinds of pressure. I think here at the Cowboys, it's a lot less pressure for the front office because they're not going anywhere, But I think for guys like Dak Prescott, for Mike McCarthy, for Dan Quinn, for Kellen Moore, there's pressure. There's going to be pressure because if they don't succeed, now you've got to hold Jerry Jones' feet to the fire and say, nah, this. And I think there's a lot of fans out there for the last 26 years that have tried to hold Jerry's feet to the fire and say, this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable, And especially when you get a team, and nothing against the Cincinnati Bengals, all it took for the Bengals was to get a couple LSU guys, and they're well on their way.
There we go, LSU.
I knew it was coming. Here it comes. Yeah.
But no, that was just tongue in cheek. But in reality, though,
yeah, I mean, you are
Cincinnati.
Right.
But Cincinnati is in the AFC Championship game. They're in there, and San Francisco was basically a bad half away from being eliminated from the playoffs altogether, but they got in, and they made things happen as they've gone along. So
around their quarterback,
yeah, they admit their quarterback's not any good and still win games. So that's where if you're a Cowboy fan, you're going, well, why them? Well, why them? Well, why them? And I don't blame them. I don't blame Cowboy fans for being pissed off the last 26 years. Because you know what? The pressure should be on all these guys. It should be on Dak Prescott. It should be on Mike McCarthy. It should be on Jerry Jones. Now, Jerry and those guys, it's a different pressure because they're not going to get fired. They're not going to get fired. They're not trying to pay for the lake house. They've already got the lake house paid for. Okay.
On a boat.
Yeah. To me, this is where, as a Cowboy fan, you want to hold Jerry Jones' feet to the fire. And like, okay, sir, you told me this, you told me this, you told me this. Make do. Do what you have to do. Yeah.
And I know we're about to wrap up here, but I just Bryan saying that about the Bengals was kind of a stark thing that I started working through in my head here while we're sitting here talking. But it's got to bug Jerry if you put it in terms like this, where it's like, Jerry, look, we're talking about the Rams. The same draft where you had pick number 4, they had pick number 1. When you were at your worst in the last decade, they were even worse. I mean, they were a bad football team at that time. They traded up. They were around there, but you're talking about a team that had the number 1 pick in 2016, has been to a Super Bowl, and is in the conference championship game right now. San Francisco has had a top 3 pick in the draft twice in the last 4 years. They're back again. They've been to the Super Bowl. They're back in the conference title game again. Cincinnati had the number 1 pick in the draft 2 years ago. Boom, they're here. It's like, Jerry, okay, is that the solution? You need to finish top 3? You need to restock like that? I mean, it does feel a little bit like, I think this is going to be a season of change. They're $21 million over the cap. They've got some free agents. I think they need to look at and go, okay, we got to revamp a little bit. I mean, we've got to just to get under, our financial thresholds, but there's got to be some changes here. And I mean, your quarterback's not going anywhere. Your coaches aren't going anywhere for a year, at least unless Kellen Moore gets a job somewhere else. But, around him, there's going to be a lot of differences, I think.
I wish the question would have been asked today. And again, our colleagues do a great job over there. To me, I would have asked Jerry, if Sean Payton was available, would we have seen a coaching change? I mean, he's available, but I mean, if Sean Payton really wanted to coach, if Sean Payton told you today he wanted to coach, would you make that change?
Yeah.
That's the question I would have asked him, you know, and he would have probably shot me down and got mad and all that. But I think things might be different if Sean had. I think Jerry knew damn good and well that Sean Payton was not going to coach this year. I think he knew that, and that's why it's able to put on this. We've worked shoulder to shoulder. You know, we've done tireless stuff together. You know, it's easy to put up this front that you've worked hard and tried to get things fixed. But the guy that you really, really want told you he didn't want to coach this year and didn't want to coach.
And KNC didn't ask him about it, and they couldn't, because Jerry would have said no, because technically it violates rules if he would have acknowledged it. But that Florio story, I don't know about all the details, but the larger point of it, from what I've heard over the last couple of years, that's accurate. He tried to get him here. That was his. That was the guy he wanted before they hired Mike McCarthy, a year before they hired him. And so I don't think anything's been done to change that. He thinks so highly of Sean Payton. And look, the things he described today about how he'd like to see Mike McCarthy step in on the offense and do some things.
Sean
He's
Payton
describing
would do that.
Sean Payton. Sean Payton will do that. Sean Payton wouldn't
Sean Payton would not let this. If this offense had 2 bad weekends in a row, Sean Payton would have done something about it. He wouldn't have let this thing continue to fester the way it did.
Yep.
It will be a dramatic offseason, as it is most off seasons for the Cowboys, but more so than others over recent years because of the change potential that could come in the cloud that hangs over this organization. Again, you can find us on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. You can find Bryan on Twitter at Bryan Broaddus. You can find our Dallas Cowboys Insider Bobby Belt at Bobby Belt TX. Make sure you subscribe to 105 Through the Fan here on YouTube, also Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at 105 Through the Fan, and also 105throughthefan.com. For Bryan Broaddus, our Super Bowl winning scout, and 1/4 of the G-Bag Nation, our Dallas Cowboys Insider, Bobby Belt for 105 Through the Fan. Appreciate you joining us on the Boys Collective here on 105 Through the Fan. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate you joining us on this episode. And I'm sure we'll have a couple more of these as the offseason goes on, depending on what happens as the world turns in Cowboys Nation. So I appreciate the time, gentlemen.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you as well.
Appreciate it.